The Sunfallen Road, Chapter 12. I didn't waste a moment. I went to the machine room and corresponded with a contact of mine at the Department of State about getting Silver a passport. I sent an email to the cleaning company that typically cared for my home when I was away and advised them that I would be going on an extended journey. I didn't say how long, but I asked them to come and upkeep the house once a week until further notice. Typically, I sent payment by wire to them when I was away, so nothing unusual was occurring. I began to think about how I would approach Glass. Silver had made me consider my career path so far, and to even further consider Glass's character. I thought about each of the regents and progenitor that I had worked for. Some were good, some were bad, some merely neutral. Glass wasn't the worst of them in terms of character, but upon further reflection, he was one of the hardest people to stomach working with in terms of how he presented himself. His undaunted arrogance. How unlike Klaus he was, who was always kind, gentle, and above all humble, a trait that rarely surfaced even among humans, let alone vampires. I wondered when I had become so lackadaisical about judging the characteristics of others. Certainly I was no saint, but among vampires I might as well have been. I only fed when I needed to. I was never cruel to my prey, nor did I terrorize them as I hunted them. I rarely killed, and certainly never for the pleasure of it. My kin did not understand my motivations. Klaus had. He understood that we had all been mortal once, and for the sake of my former life, I tried to be as human as I could. And yet, I wasn't human any longer, nor did I even think like one. As a youth, I would have pointed at the actions of people like the Regent of Paris as being ones to avoid, and oftentimes even morally reprehensible. As I aged, I became less willing to recognize the actions of others as being good or bad or neutral, perhaps because I felt so guilty about what I had become and the things I had to do to survive. I'd never been an angry person, not when I was alive, and certainly not throughout my vampirehood. But now, I began to be angry at what I was, angry at whomever had founded this dark bloodline of ours, angry at what I had to do to live. I could not live and let live. I had to feed on the living in order to live. It struck me as monstrously unfair. A sudden yearning to be human again rose with my anger, as pointless as it was. The voices whispered, wailed, screamed at the memory of death and blood and the deep, dark place all the dead travel through before they are pulled back by the potency of vampiric blood. As I sat in my chair, staring at one of my many computer screens, lost amid my despair, I felt a pair of warm hands settle onto my shoulders. Silver leaned down and kissed the top of my head. "It's almost dawn, Melpomene," said this man, this beautiful human, who had so suddenly appeared in my life and reminded me of what it had felt like to be human, to run with a beating heart through fields of sunlight, to live briefly and die so soon. I turned to look at him, and I reached up with both hands to touch his face. He was so alive. He took my hands and pulled me to my feet. He was even taller than I was, I realized for the first time. A tall, lanky, lithe creature with a man's strength. He smiled at me, kissed my forehead, my nose. I took his hand and walked with him to my room. We settled into the sheets, and he held me, and the voices sang as patterns danced on the walls on my way down into sleep. The next day, I felt more together. I had decided to go to court that evening and present the letter that Glass had asked me to compose, and also to submit my resignation once the exchange treaty had been completed. Silver nodded when I told him my decision. "Are you sure this is what you want?" he asked. I put my hands on his face, smoothed his cheekbones with my thumbs. "All I want is to have as much time with you as I can before the end," I said quietly. "That is all I care about." "There's still so much we don't know about each other," he reminded me gently. "I know you well enough to know that you make me feel more human than I have felt in 200 years, I said, "and that's enough for me." He smiled. "What do you mean, the end?" "All humans die someday, and most humans are inherently fickle." I smiled at him to let him know it was all right. "You might not want me for that long." His face registered pain. It was hard to look at, so I kissed his cheeks. I turned away from him, towards the bag that sat on the table by one of my laptop computers. I put a couple of files in it from the printer and picked it up. I wore black slacks, a white tank top, pearls. I almost never bound up my hair anymore, but today I wore it in a twisted bun high up on my head, with curls misting my forehead and skimming my cheeks. Silver looked me over and smiled. "You look beautiful." He stepped forward and kissed my cheek, careful not to muss my makeup. "Thank you. I won't be long." I drove to the regent's court and, using the shadow gift, entered without waiting for the guardians to open the gate. They were used to this trick. It used to endlessly annoy them, but I'd done it enough times that they learned not to care. Tonight, I was in a hurry. I glided through the door, my heels clacking on the marble floor in the foyer. I went directly to the hall. Glass, who was talking with the vampire who served as his steward, looked in my direction. The hall was otherwise empty aside from his attendants, as it was early in the evening. "Lady Aguilar, you are very early," he said. "Did you bring the letter?" I nodded. "Very well, let's have it," he said, casting me a slight smile as the steward stepped away. I pulled the letter in its folder from my bag and stepped forward, handing it to him. He quickly read it over and nodded at me. "Excellent work. Thank you, Melpomene." He rarely addressed me by name, so it took me by surprise. "Your Grace." "Was there anything else?" he asked. "Yes, Your Grace," I said. "Pending the conclusion of the exchange treaty with Paris, I am submitting my resignation." He looked very, very surprised, I saw, with some satisfaction. "May I ask why?" "I have spent considerable amounts of time at the courts of regents and progenitors, Your Grace," I said. "I feel that I must take some time for myself and get to know the world we live in. There is much to learn, not only from our kind, but from the humans as well." A couple of his attendants tittered. I looked sharply at them, and they quieted themselves. I wasn't the oldest of vampires at Glass's court, but I was one of the strongest, and all of Glass's attendants knew it. "How else does the world function outside of politics?" asked Glass. "It is hardly different." "But it is," I said, "and while I am thankful for having had the opportunity to work with Your Grace, it is time for a change." He nodded. "I wouldn't wish for you to be unhappy," he said, surprising me. He was being genuine. "Your service to this court has been thorough and admirable. Therefore, I accept your resignation, effective upon the conclusion of the Parisian security negotiations." "Your Grace is kind and honorable," I said, inclining my head. "I thank you." He nodded. "If you wish, you may complete the remaining paperwork at home and return it to me when it is complete. As well, if you wish, you may ask the Parisian court to correspond with you electronically and CC me in your correspondences with them." "Your Grace." I turned to go. "Melpomene," he said before I left the room. I turned. "Yes, Your Grace." "Where will you go?" he asked. I smiled and thought of Silver. "Everywhere." I returned to the house and found Silver in the kitchen. He'd made a right mess of the place, but he'd made my favorite dish, sweet and sour shrimp with fried rice and a cherry cheesecake. "Surprise!" he said as I entered. "Silver, what on earth have you done?" He practically skipped over to me. "Today marks 6 months I have spent living with you exactly, so I thought I would do something special. Come on, I just finished. Let's eat." I plunked my bag down by the door and sat at the table, watching bemusedly as he served me a heaping plate and then himself. "Has it really been so long?" I asked. He nodded. "Sure has." "Could have been yesterday." I smiled, forking up some shrimp and putting it into my mouth. "I see you've been paying attention when I cook." "I pay attention to everything you do," he said. The remark surprised me. I wasn't used to anyone paying attention to me, not even other vampires. Certainly they noticed me, but I wasn't used to being observed. I felt strangely interrupted. "What's wrong?" Silver asked me, concern creasing his forehead. I shook my head. "Nothing. I'm just not used to anyone studying me that way." "I find that hard to believe," he responded, smirking. "I pay attention to you too," I said, taking another bite. "Oh?" He looked wary. "Like how?" "How you move. How you smell. How you talk. If I were blind, I could still pick you out of a crowd." I grinned. He actually blushed. I have a question for you, I asked him. Sure, he said. Do you like sex? He blinked. Yeah, why do you ask? Just curious. You've never tried to sleep with me in spite of the fact that you're obviously attracted to me. Would you have wanted me to try? He asked, toying with his fork. I do not know. I just find it surprising that you haven't. Don't think that just because I believe in God that I'm against sex, he said. I'm not. I guess I just figure it should be your choice, not mine, in a situation like this. If you'd ever told me you wanted my body, I'd be more than willing to give it to you, but it's not up to me to take yours, even if I could. I just stared at him. He chewed his food. What? He asked, almost irritably. I smiled at him. What you said is just not at all a common sentiment among men, not even nowadays, as far as I understand. I know. But that's what I think, he said. It's a good thing. He chewed thoughtfully, and he was quiet for a time. I could almost reach up and pluck his thoughts out of thin air, and I knew what he was going to ask even before he said it. Do you want to? I chuckled. If it were to happen, I wouldn't want to conjecture about it beforehand. I would want it to happen naturally. Can vampires conceive? My smile faded. No. All the stories, at least on that account, are true. He reached over and took my hand. Don't let it trouble you. Everyone's meant for different things. Meaning maybe I wasn't meant to have children? Maybe not, he said thoughtfully. Maybe you were meant for other things.